Never expect that a manager is going to acknowledge what you're going through. When you're raising concerns about mistreatment, perhaps something unlawful on the basis of your identity, some form of a denial of an equal opportunity, that manager is not going to acknowledge your experience, especially when they're contributing to it and then you're calling them out on it. And when you go to HR, oftentimes you may actually recognize that they are going to listen to you intently to see exactly what you are complaining about, whether or not it creates a liability for them, not because they want to try to help you, but more because they want to protect the company against you. And that's one of the reasons why I don't advocate for conversations in person. I always advocate for developing paper trails, specifying clearly via email to your HR the unlawful treatment that you believe you're experiencing, the denial of that equal opportunity very clearly with the specific type of unlawful basis, and retaining a copy.
Employment attorney Mahir S is on the front lines with EWA, helping to push the Workplace Psychological Safety Act in states across the nation.
If we continue to allow workplace environments to go unchecked for the psychological abuse they engage in, we'll be a nation of mentally ill and traumatized citizens.
But without guardrails, legally speaking, do you have a case to seek justice?
We're trying to include as much as we can in terms of not just bringing public awareness, but also to educate folks, because there are a lot of people when it comes to this very, important topic, how they can find justice. And, first off, people are really concerned because they all believe that they can file a lawsuit and that they're going to find justice from the legal system. What do you tell people as an attorney? Because a lot of times I'm hearing from folks who say, I went to an employment attorney and I thought I was going to get justice. I went to the EEOC and they didn't really investigate, but they gave me the right to sue. But nothing is going to happen because I didn't kind of have that smoking gun. Is legal recourse really available for people who have experienced workplace abuse?
I think it really depends on the context and what motivates the abuse in the first place, right? So there are certain categories that are unlawful conduct, right? And then there's conduct that is not okay, but in essence is legal, right? And one of the reasons why I've been strongly advocating for creating laws against psychological abuse within the workplace has been because there is this huge gap between addressing what people actually experience and what protections they need within the workplace, getting them accountability for it, versus the system as it currently exists, only addressing legal claims that involve unlawful forms of discrimination, harassment, and other forms of retaliation with what exists within the law that's considered illegal. And so because that plays a huge role, a lot of times people, and this is kind of why, once I got into the practice of employment law, we often see people reaching out saying, I was mistreated, they yelled at me, they said something. There could be a number of things that involve forms of mistreatment and abuse. And in that process, what you will often realize is that there's a sense of hope that an individual has by reaching out to an employment attorney seeking justice. And it is very difficult for somebody to hear somebody having been harmed and then tell them that we can't help you. We can't do anything. There's no legal claim. There's no mechanism for justice within the legal system. And so it is not easy to say, but it's more difficult to hear from somebody that has been a survivor of this type of abuse. So I think, that's kind of the reason why this huge gap between who is actually the law protecting, how the law currently exists, and where the law needs to exist in order to protect people. That's been by far one of the reasons why, it became very important to me to at least raise awareness about this. It is an uphill battle. It is a difficult task, but we still have to talk about it. If we don't talk about it, then we're just allowing it to fester and just continue as it is. But and even now, I mean, I talk about workplace bullying, mobbing, other forms of psychological abuse, and a lot of the content that I put out. It's not to, it's not to invite people to reach out to me because they think that I can help them better. It's to create awareness surrounding the issue, the lack of a legal mechanism to address it, so that way we can all collectively move and support and engage in this advocacy to cater to a new law, such as the Workplace Psychological Safety Act. So that way we can really, kind of build up that momentum, which I think we've been doing really well.
Yeah, the reality of it is that, discrimination laws as they stand right now literally don't really protect people unless you have that, smoking gun where someone's called you the N-word or some other, pejorative. It's very, very difficult. But the common average person who goes through the systemic abuse in the workplace, they have no clue that proving intent is the law. That is what you have to prove. And if you can't prove that they've done something, in other words, they've called you the N-word, you really don't have any recourse. So there's nothing from a federal standpoint that can help you. Is this about overhauling the 1964 Civil Rights Act?
So I think that description and definition that you kind of provided, to many extents, is a little bit, I would say, a little bit harsher than the reality of how these cases do play out. I don't think that it's really a matter of seeing racial slurs or forms of physical, sexual assault that really trigger the laws to actually get people accountability and justice. I do think that there are mechanisms that are necessary. But what you do point out, which I totally agree with, is, do employees have enough evidence to demonstrate that somebody did something because of one of the protected classes that fall into the statute as it exists? But you're right. Listen, the law is old. It really came on the backdrop of a movement that addressed a very, very different America, and now we're seeing things in a very different light, and it's becoming more and more notorious in the sense that there's a battle that exists in terms of whose life is worth more versus, is there a sense of equality? There's a supremacy culture that is inherent within the systems that exist. And the only way that we're going to address this is by creating, I mean, obviously there are many thought leaders that believe that dismantling the system is necessary, right? That is something that certain people believe in. But there, in the mechanisms that currently exist, where dismantling seems to be a much more revolutionary concept, it's more in line with the current model that we create better laws that provide mechanisms of accountability that make it easier for the individual to prove their situation. So I think one of the factors that I often think is really important is individuals need to empower themselves with knowledge on what they need to do when they experience this. First of all, recognizing these things. As you know, just because the law says that something is illegal, not most people will never actually recognize whether or not what they're going through is illegal or discriminatory, and whether it's in relation to their identity or not. And employers are very smart. They are trained. They have to go through compliance efforts through state and federal bodies to make sure that they understand that they cannot do certain things. And so they train their management and their leadership to be culturally sensitive and racially sensitive and gender sensitive. And all these sensitivities are not driven towards really empathizing, but more about how to avoid liability. And because that's the case, you see a lot of people engaging in implicit biases. You see a lot of underlying prejudice, and you see these things playing out in ways like you would say, like, listen, it's really hard to prove, because unless they say these words, like the N word, or they use other forms of slurs based upon gender, race, disability, whatever it may be, to really put that person down and demonstrate their thought process, how would you ever be able to prove it? And so that is very challenging. But there are ways by being able to look at the overall context, look at the people that are there, look at who's being favored, who isn't. There's a lot of comparisons that have to be conducted. It's a thorough analysis that kind of can get to the root cause. But I think more importantly, um, we need better laws. We need better laws, and we need them now. We need the laws that were created in 1964 to be a lot more friendlier. The case law that has come out of it and going up and down in terms of more protections. But I really feel like racial racism and racial equality has become somewhat lesser in the context of things. I think from the perspective of the way that our mainstream media and our circles of political leadership, there is much more from the perspective of pushing forward sexual harassment, right? And it's more juicier, it's more newsworthy, and I think that there's an inherent issue with this because a lot of this is now being driven against once again by the main issue, which is money. We're talking about exploitation and abuse, and so I think there's a lot of issues that exist within our systems, and I think the way that we address accountability and seek justice, there's also a lot that needs to be done in order to kind of make it easier for the individual. But yes, number one, educating people on how to preserve evidence, how to complain, how to notify their employer, how to build up records is important. And when that falls outside of the way the law is, then at that point it's a matter of strategizing. What are the best options for your mental health? What is the best options for your well-being? Because at the end of the day, your workplace should not be causing you illness. It should not be impacting your family relations. It should not be impacting your health in a way that leaves you debilitated because you go into a workplace, you hope to come out the same. And a lot of people don't.
When you talk about sexual assault, domestic violence, it took a little while before those actually became, for the most part, laws where, it's wrong. It's clearly a criminal act. And yet, I believe that the notion of sexual assault, domestic violence, those abuses, those crimes are really based and rooted in psychological abuse. But for the psychological abuse, the grooming, if you will, of people, that is the second, third level, if you will. So I believe that if we are able to pass this law and be clear that psychological abuse is the root, the foundation upon which the sexual assault or domestic violence takes place, then perhaps we can prevent the sexual assault and the domestic violence. How do we communicate that to politicians? How do we communicate that even to the federal government? They're very clear that safety is important when it comes to OSHA. They're very clear that safety is important when it comes to, say, Boeing, if you will, providing safe planes, whistleblowers who come forward. But when it comes to the psychological abuse aspect, which is part of it, no one is kind of like hands off. How do we communicate that the root, the foundation is the psychological abuse?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the Surgeon General recently, I think maybe a year or two ago, came out with a report that specifically addressed that the psychological safety of individuals in the workplace is an essential aspect of keeping a healthy work environment because currently workplaces are toxic, right? In essence, and this is what's leading to mental illnesses across the board. I think let's look at this in another way. I think what I've heard, especially when seeing opposition to the Workplace Psychological Safety Act and creating laws that will essentially protect individuals with respect to their psychological safety that have experienced workplace bullying, mobbing, and things that are outside of those protective characteristics that currently exist within the law, is that it would open up a can of worms for the court system, that the court system is so overwhelmingly overburdened that the idea that the legal system would not be able to really handle the sheer amount of volume, and they would not be able to really figure out how, like they could not, there would be, it would be very difficult to figure out what claim is the real versus what isn't, that it would be like anybody could just say that they were, and this is a right-wing theology, which is,
We're going to have more lawsuits.
Yeah, we're not concerned about your feelings, right? The feelings are not what we're, so a lot of the lawsuits, the cost is a major driving force for a lot of people that are in opposition to this type of thing. But I think more importantly, I think it's a corporate thing. I think it's a corporations and employers type of ideology that, listen, we maintain environments that are meant to, in essence, get productivity and be profitable. And if we are now going to be presented a law that is going to limit our ability to engage in the type of abuse that is legal and the type of exploitation that is legal, then in essence, we become subservient to people. And how could we ever become subservient to people in that we be catering to an environment where people actually might actually have an equal opportunity within the workplace? How could we do that? So I think that is what we need to see as the problem, and what thought process is essentially rejecting this ideology, and how do we overcome that? I think, with our people in political positions, I don't like to call them leaders because I think leadership, in terms of a definition, is something that requires people to put the priorities of others beyond themselves and other agendas. Um, and so I think people in positions of power need to be held accountable and be brought on board with these movements. They need to recognize that there is a large scale movement at play. So I think the way that we're going to have to build this is initially through a local process, passing legislation at the city level, like in cities such as New York City and in California, where there is more likelihood of passing more broad protections for individuals, where you have the highest chance of being able to get these laws passed, is the first step. That has historically been the way that this process unfolds, and then start to build up in the states, and then start spreading more states until it becomes more compelling at a larger level, at the local level, that it is something that at the federal level we need. I think there needs to be a little bit more of a localized movement more than a more of a federal movement. The federal process is too financially driven. And I don't think that a movement of this scale, because the truth is, there's just so many people that are eager. I mean, just alone yesterday, I spoke to at least 3 people that that basically were saying, we want to be involved in advocacy. We want to be able to. This is a part of our healing process. Our healing is not by getting justice. Some people just want an apology. People just want to be acknowledged that what they went through was wrong, and the people that did it acknowledge that they did this and it was not okay, and that they apologize for it. Sometimes they are willing to just take that. Um, and the companies are so against that type of a thing because they cannot acknowledge responsibility. They cannot take accountability. There's just so many people out there that are like, listen, I just want to be able to get involved. I want to be able to advocate. I want to be able to, be a part of a movement where I can share my experiences, how I can help people avoid going through these things, how I can, make sure that they get out when it's right, then when it's time to get out, and not allow themselves to feel like they should remain in such a place. Um, there's a lot of people that are willing to do that. So I think that there's a lot more we can do in terms of creating a collective movement towards, pushing forward for a law on a local scale and building up from there.